Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. We're going to talk about data monetization exchange. And as David said, we've got a fantastic group of panelists today. Some of them have been good friends for many, many years, and I think we'll have a great discussion. So from my side, we started ANMIT a little bit more than 3 years ago, and it's been a phenomenal journey. We have been incredibly fortunate to work with some of the world's greatest companies around the whole topic of data valuation, data monetization, and exchange. And what we'll talk about today is a bit of context about for organizations there, how data is one of the most undervalued assets for those organizations, what the barriers are to those, and what would be a strategic approach to that. This is just the ANMIT view, and then what we'll do is we'll open it up to the panel discussion, and hopefully people will have different views. So it's to have a discussion today. This is a very young and emerging area, and something that I think requires us to have better discussions around this whole new asset class. So if we then look at the next one, and we say, well, why are we saying it's one of the most undervalued assets of the organization? Well, this slide, many of you would have seen something similar. This is the Ocean Tomo data that shows that in 1975, you could account for 83% of the market value of the S&P 500 by adding up the balance sheets. So in other words, the book value of those companies. Today, it's less than 10%. So it's a phenomenal shift that's happened over those years. And the reality is, if you think about intangible assets, data is definitely one of the biggest intangible assets of any organization. So we're going to hold that as a premise, and then we'll explore a little bit about how you unpack the value of the data there. So if we look at this slide, what we'll see is you'll see different asset classes. And this is in billions. So these are some really, really big numbers. So what you'll see, the derivatives currently make up more than more than a third of the value of the total market. So things like silver and gold aren't even visible on here, and crypto isn't even visible on here because it's such a small slice of the market. Stock markets, as you can see, make up a significant chunk, but nothing compared to the broad money supply, global real estate and debt. Now, what's interesting is that we are seeing an emerging space for data assets. And not only is it an asset in its own class, but as you can imagine, will become a significant derivative market as well. And just as context then, this is why we think it's a very timely time to have this discussion about data. So we'll talk about three things. The first is data isn't viewed at scale. When we talk to boards of companies that we haven't worked with before, it's very clear that although they all nod when you say data is valuable, I don't think anybody disagrees with that. What we do see, however, is that there is no understanding about the scale of the value. So what we try and do, first of all, is to help the executives and the board understand what the value is of the asset class. And then we'll talk a little bit about the uniqueness of this asset class, and we'll talk a bit about what needs to be done to get it to the right place. So the first thing that we realize when we talk to organizations is that quite often they ask about how much can we get for a specific data set? In other words, the little bubbles on the left-hand side. And they say, how would we able to monetize that? Now, it's interesting because if you take that approach, what tends to happen is that you become a price taker rather than a price maker. So in order to really explore how you get the most from your data asset, you need to take a different view. You need to take a view of the total enterprise value of the organization and understand what the data asset is worth to your investors, but then also understand what it's worth to the other stakeholders of the organization, such as customers, employees, and suppliers. And it's only then when you can get out of this price taker approach to being a price maker in terms of data. Secondly, so if you look at what we have here, this is Highways England. So the first thing we do for an organization such as Highways, which is a non-listed company, is to say, identify the intangible value. Then we identify the key stakeholders, we identify the value drivers of the organization, and we identify the data assets that come with that. And in that way, you've got a whole that links to something understandable. And if it's a listed company, we link that to the stock price of the company. Now, the other thing that we're seeing is that the markets have emerged over many, many thousands of years. The first market was probably when people were trading Sumerian goats. I don't know if that's a correct term, having Sumerian goats, but you know what I mean, the goats in Sumeria. 4,500 BC. Since then, clearly markets have evolved in many ways. And the first stock exchange, as we know, it was in Amsterdam. And then the first commodities market was the Chicago one in 1864. But what we're seeing at the moment are lots of startups talking about being data exchanges, okay? The question is, can you really exchange something that doesn't have the key attributes as we define them for an asset, which is you need to know how to value it and what price it can be sold at. Secondly, you need to have a guarantee of the condition of it. In other words, like gold, you know, if it's 24 carat, it has a certain value, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of those things have not been defined yet. So I think although there's been an explosion of these new exchanges, what we're finding is actually quite worrying. And this is supported by some research that was done in Harvard Business Review, that the quality of the data is exceptionally poor. And one of the reasons is there's no definition of the standard. In other words, the 24 carat standard that's required for data has not emerged yet. So what we're dealing with is quite a lot of unreliable data. And the problem even more so with that is that people are using that to train neural networks and so on poor data. So there is a real issue going on here. And I think as business and data professionals, it's critical that we start to change the discussion about this away from a technology exchange to saying, what do you really need in order to exchange data? So at Anwood, we have a specific approach to this. This is all a new area of evolution, and we're learning every day. But we've been fortunate to work with some of the world's leading organizations in this space. And what we see is that you need to, first of all, accept that intangibles now is a significant value. If you don't accept that, and that it's not the physical world anymore that creates the value, you're not going to be able to deal with data, because data is a value item, and the value is like beauty in the eye of the beholder. So you have to understand that you look at intangibles in a different way to how you look at it in physical asset space. The second thing is you need to understand how that links to a specific quantified value. So in the case of listed companies, we link that to the market cap of the company. And then further on, we look at what do these data assets that we identify create for the stakeholders of the organization. And therein you identify the arbitrage opportunities, and that's where the real value lies. So one of the big thinking flaws that we see organizations have is they look at the things that they think is the most valuable data, and they say, we want to sell our customer data, or et cetera, et cetera. Actually, what you need to look for are the arbitrage opportunities for things that are less valuable to you, but really valuable to somebody else. And then once you've done that, you need to understand, how do I deliver that to somebody in a way that extracts that value for them? In other words, understand the cost to deliver the arbitrage, and then finally manage the delivery. So it's a pretty obvious process. This is an example of a roads agency. previously, they looked at data valuation from a perspective of what's it worth to us. So for example, they have a data set about the scheduling of roadworks, which to them is currently seen as a bit of an expense and a nuisance. The quality of that was not great, okay? But actually, once they started to look at the arbitrage side of it, understood what the stakeholders valued about their data, they could see organizations such as Amazon, FedEx, Royal Mail, etc., really needed that data to be able to schedule their routes properly. And it can save billions of pounds to those organizations. So although this agency saw it as a not so critical data set, actually for their customers, it is a critical data set. It's that flip that you need, and that's why you need the stakeholder-based and enterprise value of data. So I won't go into the NHS one because it's been a complete debacle about how the NHS has been managing its data, but suffice it to say, it's probably worst practice in every possible way. In many ways, NHS trusts have given away data for 5% of the actual value. And secondly, in some cases, they've signed away their own right to the usage of that data, which is unbelievable, but is the reality. So we won't dwell on the NHS one, but that is not best practice. So I'm going to hand over to David now to take over the panel and Q&A discussion and intro all the panelists for us. Thank you, David.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Herman. Let's just stop the screen sharing. Great. So we should be getting the panelists up on stage, as it were. Perfect. Okay. So what we're going to do very quickly is ask each of the panelists, Grant, Eddie, and Miranda, to introduce themselves, explain what their experiences in this space and what their sort of top 3 takeaways would be. And then we'll get into the panel discussion. So Grant, you were first to join. Do you want to kick off?
Thanks, David. It's really nice to be with you this morning, and good to listen to that introduction from Herman. So I'm really excited about the prospect of data exchange or data pooling for the construction industry, which is what I work in. It's a low margin, high risk industry with historically poor performance. So data has the potential to really transform our businesses and the service to our customers. So just very briefly, construction sector, it delivers about 170 billion per annum into the UK economy. So it's about 10% of GDP. So really significant in terms of the impact on UK performance. But University of Oxford have looked at studies of over 12,000 projects and concluded that a disastrous 1 in 200, 0.5% finish on time, on budget, and deliver the benefits to the customer. So that's shocking. So it's getting worse because we're getting increasing complexity, faster delivery, more for less. And we need to shift our approach to projects from experience and instinct to a new way of using data to back our decision making. And I've been in the industry for 30 years. I'm not a data person, so don't ask me too many technical data questions. I'm an operational projects guy. And I've always used data, but the digitalization of construction over the last sort of 5 years or so has created sort of exponentially increasing volumes of data from our projects. And greater fidelity, the sort of resolution revolution has improved the fidelity of the data such that we can really get some precise understanding of what's going on. And of course, concurrently, advances in data analytics have now enabled us to extract some pretty cool insights that were just not previously possible and codify lessons learned from projects. But sadly, we're just not using our project data. A recent report from the RICS identified that construction project data, over 90% of construction project data, is only used once generated and used once. And secondly, no single organisation in our sector has the volume or scope of data to unlock those truly meaningful insights. So to make some progress, or we can make progress individually, that's definitely without doubt. But to transform an industry, which is the ambition, we're going to need to collaborate to create that data at scale that Herman referred to, work together, and probably most importantly, learn together about how to do this and how to learn the skills we need to really deploy that data. And out of that came the idea of a construction data trust. So this was born back in 2018. We had a vision to create a not-for-profit organisation that would work for the interests of the collective, to help shape and extract insight from project data to drive transformational change in the sector. And the way we structured that is creating a sort of ecosystem that will allow us to accelerate change in the sector for all participants, clients, contractors, suppliers, to transition to data-driven project delivery, creating the infrastructure to securely pool data, facilitating access, but protecting the interests of the data providers, encouraging collaborative working, and we're pretty good at that in construction, but we're doing it with data. We want to develop an industry-wide data schema for project delivery. So really providing that framework, which will help companies and projects develop their own data ecosystems. And probably really importantly is facilitating and accelerating development and democratization of project data solutions to help that transformation. So as I say, started in 2018, Construction Data Trust, the idea was formed. We bid into Innovate UK, part of government, in 2019, but were unsuccessful in that bid for some funding to get this going. Apparently we were being too ambitious, but there was a hardcore of us, small group of organizations who've persevered. And during 2020, we formed a company as a not-for-profit to operate just like any other trust would operate. We formed a board of director trustees and an independent advisory group, which has come from across industry, public and private sector. We've put in place the infrastructure to start data pooling. We're doing that in partnership with Microsoft, which we're very grateful for their support. And we've appointed an independent data steward. The model of a data trust is through independent stewarding, and that data steward is pooling and organizing data, but also ensuring compliance with data and competition legislation. And probably most excitingly, we've actually starting to build a bit of a global network. There are similar organizations or similar groups in other countries, particularly in USA and Canada, we're talking to about getting construction data trusts established in those regions. So we're actually doing something today. We have our first collaboration with an organization called the Construction Productivity Task Force. They're looking at improving productivity in the commercial construction world. And they've put their money where their mouth is and provided some financial investment to the Construction Data Trust over the next 6 months. And we're working with multiple data providers to pool, organize, and analyze data to inform their activities in productivity. This is the first sector-based data trust in the UK. So we're actually building a whole legal framework for data trusts in the UK, which is aligned to the government data strategy. So we're very grateful to have support from the Open Data Institute, who are also supporting that legal work. And we're engaging widely. We're seeking members and actively engaging with potential stakeholders. And I found myself in the last couple of months in front of the several government bodies, including the Public Accounts Committee, who were very interested in data and how they can use data to improve government performance. The All-Party Parliamentary Group on Data Analytics and the Infrastructure Projects Authority, who we're working with them on helping provide and create project data strategies. And probably one of the reasons I'm here today is we're out spreading the word about and sharing experiences about what we've been doing on data pooling and data exchange and what's starting to emerge from that. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be with you, David and Herman, today.
Thank you, Grant. Very, very exciting stuff that you guys are doing.
Brilliant. Right. Let's move on to the next panelist. Miranda, you're unmuted. Do you want to go next?
Right, thank you very much, and lovely to see you all, if not in the flesh. And so my employment history in data is that for many years I've been working with data sets which were considered general purpose technologies. So I used to run Royal Mail's address database PAF, and I also used to work for Ordnance Survey, both data sets which were under sustained, let's call it attack, by the open data community, who thought that this extremely valuable data set should be given away for free to enhance the economy. All the evidence was that when this data was given away, the biggest beneficiaries were on the west coast of the US, and you can make your judgments about that. And so that was a failure, I thought, of the transaction model in data, where value was being delivered, but somehow we were failing to capture it. And that, I think, through years of talking about it, is the lack of sophistication in capturing value. and that's around the value of data. So I'm thrilled to talk to Herman. I'm always delighted to hear what Herman has to say. More recently, I've been working with the National Digital Twin Programme, which came out of the National Infrastructure Commission's Data for the Public Good, which the idea there was to allow the secure and resilient sharing of data to deliver better services relating to infrastructure. One of the biggest problems we've had there is that whilst we recognise that those who invest in the mechanisms for the sharing and exploitation of data should receive value for the investment they have made, often the problem is that people are investing in data where the beneficiaries are second down the line and have no easy way of returning value in the time period over which the investment was made. So I'm really interested to hear about questions from the floor and ideas from the other panelists.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Miranda. Fascinating stuff. Eddie.
Great to hear, and be amongst such a great group. Eddie Short. I've been working with data for 25 years. Phil, been doing it a long time. Herman and I worked together 10 years ago at KPMG. And for the last 3 years, I've been working in telecoms, and then I find myself as Virgin Media O2, as Virgin Media, as Liberty Global and Telefonica merged their assets in the UK, so we're Virgin Media O2. I think having come from the last 3 years in telecoms, that you'd say that at some points they've been seen to be leaders in data and data monetization. In other areas, we've still got a long way to go. I mean, I think O2's turnover, for example, in the UK was £6 billion. We've been doing 8 years of data monetization, and I think really the products that we were producing, which are known as O2 Motion, but we provide a lot of insights around what people do around traffic and movements. We were advising governments during the pandemic, as were a lot of the telcos. But out of our 6 billion, the amount we're actually monetizing from data is in the low tens of millions. So it's literally still a rounding error in terms of our turnover. I think the interest for me is kind of say, it's when you look at monetizing and leveraging your own data, it's kind of I use the kind of analogy, it's a bit like when people talk about data as the new oil. I think of it as like panning for gold. You've actually got an awful lot of crap and only a few really valuable nuggets. Where I think real opportunities exist is, as Miranda and Grant have been talking about, bringing different data sets together and different capabilities together to actually provide a more valuable data set. And I think as a company now, as operating in the telecoms, and increasingly we want to see ourselves in the digital space, we have a position where we need to coexist with some of the, say, those big digital businesses, the Googles and Facebooks, the Amazons, who have a massive, ultimately people call them tech companies, digital companies, but their first, second and third source of competitive advantage is data. We currently have about 2,500 attributes that we can collect around an individual, which we really get from where we've got consent with what you're doing with your phone, where you're going. We also therefore know a lot of what people do, again, provided we've got consent. And therefore we are able to not just create assets that I think that can be useful for people in terms of understanding infrastructure planning and you'd say construction, and say where people should be putting retail, but really all around movement of data and actually what people want to do. But that's really can only be really valued if you combine that with the capabilities of banking, capabilities of transport, construction, and other areas. So, and I look at this and say, the concept of sharing and pooling is really important. I mean, for me, I did a piece of work a few years ago for the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industries. I think many of us know that drug trials, that we've had the most successful trials of all time in the last 12 months with coronavirus vaccinations, but up until 2014, 2015, drug trials took an inordinate amount of time, and the fact was there wasn't any data sharing. So actually 90% of drug trials were actually repeating the trials. AstraZeneca is repeating something that Glaxo's, or a compound that Glaxo's already tried, which Pfizer had also already tried 5 years ago. And their ability to pull things, I think, as one of the reasons why we've seen significant improvements in terms of the speed of being able to improve. And so I think there's the process improvement and then turning that actually into valuable assets. So I think there's an efficiency and effectiveness and an optimization leading to revenue and growth. And I think ultimately we're all looking at things and say, well, you know, what can we do to create that data P&L, that data valuation? Because as Urban put it, you know, 90% of the valuation of a company is now in intangibles. Data is clearly one of the critical assets. You know, people did a lot of work 10, 15 years ago to put brand as an asset, but what can we do, and how can we work with our accounting colleagues as well in finance to ultimately, I think, get people like the International Accounting Standards Board to accept data as an asset, because that will help us all in terms of, because finance folks obviously control the purse strings and a lot of these things. The more that we can actually demonstrate this is not just an intangible thing that if you move it, then we might actually increase our share price, but actually we can at least get something that is as close to understandable and measurable as possible, the better we'll be. So that's my focus.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Eddie. We're so lucky to have all you lot on board. I guess the first question to kick off, it's a relatively simple question, but it belies the complexity of the answer, I guess. This is an incredibly complex area with so much nuance in it, yet particularly, as Eddie, you alluded to, over the last 12 months with COVID and the vaccines, that it's really been brought to the fore. And we've seen a lot of both horror stories in the media and amazing positives. And we know in our work that the data leaders are getting asked by their boards, you know, what can we do with it in this space? How can we monetize? How can we generate revenue, etc.? What's your advice to someone in that position who's trying to sort of educate the board to a degree about the complexities and the risks and the opportunities, while sort of managing that conversation in a way that they can control and is helpful for moving things forward, as opposed to, you know, setting the expectations in completely the wrong space? So Grant, shall we start with you on that one, and then anyone else just chime in?
Thanks, David. So the approach we've had to take is construction businesses are not terribly data savvy. They understand they've got lots of data. They understand technology, and digital technology is a bit of a focus for construction CEOs at the moment about what technology can we bring in, but that technology is focused on how we can improve what people are doing, improve the productivity, efficiency, and in many instances just forgetting that that technology creates some really valuable data and not realizing the data. So the approach we've taken, I've taken, and we've taken in our business, and we're talking to other construction businesses, has been around getting to the nub of what are the key problems you're trying to solve around safety, around quality, around carbon, around productivity, and then transitioning that story into how you can use your data to help solve those problems, and then how you can use your data with other people's data to help solve the problem. So I don't find myself starting with data conversations with data when I talk about the data trust. I start talking about problems that need sorted and talking to groups who are already collaborating on those problems and trying to open their eyes to the possibility of using data to help solve those problems.
Great, yeah. Meet the audience where they are, as opposed to trying
kind
to
of
get your space. Yeah,
I would love to hear Eddie's view, because Eddie's seen this movie hundreds of times. So Eddie, what's your view on this?
I think it's kind of horses for courses. I think sometimes you do have to talk about data, and I think the reality is, I think a number of my colleagues are now starting to realise, actually, you know, if we keep, as I say, when we're doing a lot of initiatives, bolt-on data at the end, because that's, it's an old school, just because actually we forget about the investment we need to put in reporting and analytics. We need to drive things through data. And you know, against a 21st century operating model is powered by data, because actually architecturally everything is driven by data. The data model actually defines, when you integrate systems and you integrate actually, why do you integrate them? To move data from one place to another. Why do you need to do that? Because of the data model. So I think don't be afraid to basically use the term data. I think personally, it is the challenge of actually bringing it to life and reality with CFOs, because actually they control a lot of the data, and actually say the numbers are king, and they do want the tangibility, as I touched on. I think that's where we've got to get much better on the valuation point, that something is credible for a CFO to understand. But then I would say, know your customer is an important thing, to Grant's point. And I think it's not always the right start of data, because ultimately it's what problem we're trying to solve. I think it's, are we working on the right questions? You can have all the data in the world and all the data scientists, but if we're not working on the right problems, then our problems we can address, or our data can address. And I think that's where a lot of data monetization initiatives have failed. We're all trying to do wonderful things, but actually our data, it's like my panning for gold thing. You actually pull up a lot of shit. Your data and your skills are not appropriate to finding the nuggets, or you don't actually have the nuggets that are relevant to that problem. So I think you have to think around it, and again, know your audience, know the problems that you're trying to solve, and build some stakeholders around the organization to work with. So.
Brilliant. Thanks, Eddie. Miranda.
I've just got, I would quote a couple of people who think about this brilliantly. So Caroline Bellamy, who is at the MOD now, says that you need to build friends everywhere, because you're not going to be able to deliver the value instantly. So if you share data to improve your customer insight, for example, does the marketing director love you enough that they're going to credit you with better data, or are they just going to say that their team are marvelous and all need pay rises? And so she says, build a load of friends, find the real problems that you can deliver value in solving, and that you're going to get sufficient credit for. You don't need all the credit, but you need somebody who's not going to say it's all yours, all theirs. And also Devon Crowley-Street from Highways England talks in really compelling fashion about many CEOs have a number of people who are directly accountable for their physical assets and delivering value from their physical assets. But who do they eyeball when they need to talk about delivering value from their intangible assets? And rather than having somebody who's talking about the infrastructure and the technology that supports them, who do they eyeball and who do they hold accountable? And if you can drive that conversation with sufficient friends in the boardroom, then you're going to take yourself to a different place.
Great, brilliant. Thank you, Miranda. We've got a great question from Carl that's it's piqued my economics interest about what is a company. So it's for Grant. Grant, do you think a company whose clients have large amounts of data should act as a data trust for their clients?
Great question. Yeah, great question. One we've sort of debated. I mean, I think. One of the things we've been spending quite a bit of time in the last 18 months doing is trying to avoid lots of data trusts springing up across our sector, because that sort of completely goes against the whole idea of a data trust, which is, it's a bit altruistic, but one big data trust for what is a huge sector might be a bit too ambitious. But the value is in aggregating as much as you possibly can, and the model we've been trying to sort of promote and develop is how a data pool can have subpools and subtrusts to deal with specific problems, specific clients, specific programs of work, that sort of idea. I guess in theory, an organization could provide that as a service, but you're immediately limiting yourself. And one of the key things that comes out of the data pooling piece is that whole benchmarking piece. In actual fact, you don't look outside your own box. You've really no idea if you're doing well or not, apart from the immediate feedback you're getting from your customer. Whereas the minute you get into sort of looking at how other people do, as we do all the time, we read the press articles about we read about other companies winning work or other companies' financial performance being an easy one to compare and benchmark. The minute you open that box, you suddenly get everyone understanding what good looks like, and you drive up productivity in the industry, and you end up with everyone doing a little bit better every time. So I think boxed off data trust has some value, but it has some limitations in terms of how far it could potentially take you.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Miranda, can you talk to this question? Because I know you've done quite a bit of work around that from a more public sector side.
Well, so I defer to Grant on data trust. He's the expert there. I think what we're seeing, either there are a number of ways of transacting data. There's been some interesting questions about, which is the best way. And I like to talk about the one that failed. So the Copenhagen Data Exchange tried to set up a mechanism whereby everybody involved in city data in Copenhagen had a platform to share it. The problem was that the people who set it up, and they were Hitachi, and they talked very openly about this, is they were trying to make money out of that exchange. But because there was no concept of value, and some people were putting their data up there just for purposes of transparency, there was no way to create a market successfully. So we're learning. I think we have to recognize we're at the beginning of the journey, and investing too much in the mechanisms of trade will probably be an overinvestment. I think I would like to think much more about the exchange of value. So we're going to get much more value from an efficient supply chain because we've shared information about suppliers. We're going to get much more value because people don't hurt themselves at work. And that's what Grant's trying to do with Construction Data Trust, but also the National Underground Asset Register, which the Cabinet Office through the Geospatial Commission are powering, and where people are going to get value, which we're not worried about the monetization of the balance sheet value, but we are going to show that it can be done across these sort of diagonal timelines that I've talked about, that we're going to see the greatest advance.
Brilliant. Thank you. Eddie, have you got anything to add? Or shall I move on to
I would just say, I mean, I haven't set up a data trust, but I would just say, coming back to the point about West Coast American companies and financial, I think it's dangerous to think that we can be too altruistic about this. Wherever things will go, where the money goes. So private equity, hedge funds, if they see an opportunity here, they will basically be looking at it, as you say, as a for-profit enterprise. So I think we do need to recognize that and be on the front foot, and because I think anything that I welcome Grant's ideas are not for profit, but I think it's like you're almost like selling yourself short by the fact that you don't want to make a profit, because it's kind of that's where the value is. So it's kind of, that's a catch-22, but.
It's been a real dilemma, actually, Eddie. It's a really good point, and it's one we talk about. And although I talk about not-for-profit, I think one of the things we can see is as you start to create that data pool, that has significant value, never mind for the data contributors in the community, which is the point that Miranda's making about value that you can create to individuals. I think we can commercialize that at a point in time, open that up to asset solution providers, that sort of stuff, and then that becomes a commercial cycle that, frankly, one of the downsides of an independently stewarded data trust is the cost of running the independently stewarded data trust. And therefore, if we can find a way of commercializing the asset, that covers that cost. And then we've got the luxury of having some surplus to decide whether we distribute it or we spend it and invest it on new innovation and new invention. And that would be a good place to be. At the moment, we're every penny sort of being scraped in to try and get the thing going, because the transitional commercial state is really difficult to get up and running.
Fascinating. Actually, the cost side of it is something that rarely gets talked about. The talk in the industry is very much around the mechanics of it, GDPR, privacy, etc., the licensing and all that side of things. But the raw just practicality of what are the sorts of costs of this, and how do you go about conceptualizing those and making sure they're as sort of accurate as possible. Eddie, can you talk to some of that real sort of practical level of, if you're exploring this side of data monetization from a cost perspective, what have been your biggest learnings?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly consent is a really important message. I mean, I think a lot of the things that we've done in Telefonica, we've gone for completely anonymized data sets, and that on the one side is good, but then actually it does limit the value. I think that's but then in that sense, you'd say it is our customers' data, and we need to basically respect that fact. So we've looked at it in terms of with our O2 Motion assets. We spent an awful lot of investment building the initial core platforms, and now that cost is you'd say there is actually the storage of the data, there's data scientists, but then actually it's connecting to people and actually convincing them that it is actually of use. But maintaining it, I'd say, going from where we are today, which is basically scratching the surface, to the next level up, it basically does involve more engagement with third parties. I think pooling of the data and actually being more ruthless about the questions that we can solve with the data. And privacy becomes ever more important, because as you're trying to, as we would largely be a consumer organization, when is it the customer's data? When you've connected it to 3 or 4 different data sets and you've created a completely new data set, we have to prove to regulators that it's then something that is unique, but then if somebody can trace that back and say it's not unique and you can still derive the individual, we still have, you'd say some of the biggest costs for in this space could be regulators and actually people, as we've seen, increasingly I would say third-party agencies are coming back trying to actually create cases to actually sue you for actually misuse of data and actually put the regulators on your tail. And obviously, worst case, those fines around GDPR can be tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds. So that's actually, you say, ultimately becomes a risk management problem. So the actual cost versus the risk you're carrying is something that really becomes an important thing. And then you clearly do need legal, your general counsel team fully on side and fully supportive, and lawyers don't come cheap, and you've probably got external counsel as well as internal counsel, and suddenly the cost of just the technology which you could get in the cloud and everything is a minor part of it. So there are an awful lot of elements to think about as you layer it up and you get more exposure, which I'm sure, Grant, you're finding you've got, as you try to get lots and lots of different agencies together, you've got an awful lot of lawyers in it.
Right. Yeah. The risk register is growing at the same exponential pace as the data in terms of what we might be getting into. I think interesting enough, the technology side of things is almost zero cost at the moment. The technology organisations are leaning in, saying we want to help you do what you're going to do, and have commitments of multiple years investment to try and help get it going. It is those costs around, it is those legal costs. I mean, and participants, I'm giving you my data. Why do you want to charge me to do something with it? That's like my contribution is my data. Why do I need to spend some more money? So yeah, our bid to Innovate UK was over 2 million for 12 months getting this up and running. So we know it's a pretty extensive investment, and now we're doing it for sort of edge of desk, edge of seat stuff in terms of trying to beg, borrow, and steal to get little bits of money to get up and running. But it is a significant challenge. You can sort of see in the future when you get to a point where you're a bit like the National Trust, you have thousands of members all contributing a few pounds, and your asset is pretty well still starting to be established. You can see a low cost of participation and a relatively efficient way of running a system that's up and running at that point. But as I say, that transitional state of getting from today to that future state is incredibly intensive in terms of all resources.
Brilliant. Thank you.
David, we've got some interesting questions here. We've got several questions from Carl about health data. Carl, I'm going to tackle it in a slightly different way, because I think it also plays to Ian Wilson's question. So one of the key things that we started the discussion out with is to say intangibles now make up 90% of the S&P 500. Okay, and it's probably a little bit less for the FTSE 100, but it's not. It is a very, very high percentage of the FTSE as well. The reality is that most boards do not understand even remotely the value of the data asset that they have. So what is happening is a lot of the initiatives that are happening around this are nickel and diming it, and the real winners are the people that get the value of data, the Googles of the world, et cetera, and they're always willing to provide their cloud infrastructure to people who have data, because that gives them the access to it. And unfortunately, what we've seen in the UK health sector, and not just in the UK, in Latin America as well, is that the health sector, the public health sector does not understand the value of the data they have, and therefore are willing to give it away in some cases for less than 5% of the value of that data. And in some cases, they've even given away their own rights to that data along with that, which is a horrible scenario that is played out. So to give you a sense of when we talk about the value of data, if you look at, Eddie, the organization that O2 belonged to, Telefonica, I think it's roughly worth about $30 billion of market cap. If you were to go to the board to say your data is worth $10 billion, that changes the conversation. But then you need to be able to back that up. You need to be able to say, how did we get to that answer? And Ian, that's kind of where your question comes in about how do you do this? You know, and the valuation of data is an extremely complex thing, but just like anything else, it can be done. But you need to have a method that is repeatable and reliable, and that you can prove that, you know, this is kind of how you get to the answer. The reality is, for a large number of companies, their data assets make up more than 20% of their market cap. So, you know, that starts to change the conversation at the board level. So rather than asking for a few 100,000 or a few million to make investments in data, once you change it to say, this is one of your biggest assets, but you're totally ignoring, you're totally blind to it. And why are we blind to it? Because in the accounting profession has dealt with intangibles very poorly. Now, I'm a qualified, triple qualified accountant, so I feel like I can be vocal about this, that we have no ability to properly look at intangibles, not just for data, but also for R&D. And it's hurting the UK economy, it's hurting our ability to look at long-term solutions around global warming, etc., because we are looking at very short-termist financial measures. So, and data needs to be looked at as not only just the efficiency value of it for the organization, but also the outcome value for the other stakeholders, the customers, etc. And you can place a value on that. So that's I guess the main point that I'd make is change the game by showing the organization, the board, that this is one of their biggest assets. And you can prove to them why it is, what the implication is for customers, etc. The second thing is show them where the arbitrage opportunities are. And these are enormous opportunities that they can then start to utilize. And then you can go case by case and say, okay, let's prove that. Let's go and take some of these, but put proper investment behind it. I think all of us around this call recognize that one of the biggest challenges is that people confuse technology with data. They are not the same thing. The technology is an enabler for the data. It is much less valuable than the data. So that is one of the big challenges, that the funding, the budgetary lines in organizations are often more skewed through the technology part of it than the data part of it. So you know, I can carry on for hours. As you can see, I'm super passionate about this. But the reality is, where we've worked with organizations where they've changed that dynamic, and the organization gets the value of the data, if you think about the deal that Pfizer did with Israel, that wasn't an accident. They understood the value of the data, okay? Because they knew if they could prove that their vaccine is safe and have you know, the data to prove it, that makes a world of difference. So the value of that data has added billions to Pfizer's market cap. So for giving away, yeah, let's call it a few £100 million worth of vaccines for free, they got billions of market cap. That's the value of data. That's the outcome value that organizations need to focus on. And they are really nickel and diming this. My hope is that for the UK government, we can actually start really looking at data as a valuable asset and treating it as such, because we are not doing this properly. I'm really, really concerned about, we have some of the most valuable data assets in the world, and we're giving it away to organizations such as Palantir, and I think that's irresponsible, and I will vocally say that on a public platform. Anyway, I will keep quiet.
Who wants to come in after that, or shall I move on to another question? Move on. All right, thanks, Miranda. Well, actually, this one kind of follows. It's hang on, where are we doing? Right, final 5 minutes. So any more questions, please get them on. Ian Jones has asked a good one about, it was interesting to hear the COVID and mobile data story. And it actually speaks to what Herman was just saying, but does the panel have any other experiences of leveraging non-financial value from their data sets, obviously in this context? Miranda, you're nodding. Go for it.
I was nodding because I think that's a really good question. Because the transaction models are immature, I've just answered a really good question about, isn't it all data governance? I think there are 4 things that mean that data is really difficult to value. People don't even know it exists, and there are lots of liability and questions about that. If I give you my data and you do a much better job of it, I'm going to look like a right idiot, and also it might expose me to liability. So that's not always a simple conversation. People don't understand the specification to which it was gathered, and in general, the further you take away data from its sort of host specification, the less likely it is to create value. So you need a really good understanding of the data specification. So if you only included data about Thursdays, then it's less useful, for example. The governance is a really important thing. Am I allowed to share it? And then how do I trade it? And those 4 things mean that these examples are hard to come by. I have seen some good positive examples. So I work with a company called C-Sense, who make bike lights in Northern Ireland, and they gather data about where cyclists go, where they swerve, where they crash, where they're having a jolly good time. And this is, outside the segment of people who run about in Lycra at high speed. And that data doesn't exist, is really difficult to aggregate. And that has value when you're making decisions about infrastructure, particularly when you're trying to encourage people to use active travel. So that you get benefits across the livability and the health and well-being of a city, and you've made investment in the right place for your infrastructure. So data has value when it de-risks a decision or it helps you make a better decision. And so that's my best example of those.
Yeah, I mean, I would just build on that and just say often it's what's implicit in a lot of what we said is data is an and. Almost on its own, it's of less value, but it's when it's combined with something else, it's an and. I mean, it's like talking to our radio engineers. I mean, increasingly designing a modern mobile network and actually physical network is a radio engineering plus a data problem or data science problem. Because when we talk about CRM and marketing, they're process problems which are much better with data. So it's the and that's probably the bit that makes it difficult to value. It's kind of what's the and worth? But for me, it's 1 + 1 is 1 + 1 is 3, or is it 1 + 1 is 5, or is it 1 + 1 is actually 1.5, or just 1? That's when we get into the nitty gritty, because a lot of the benefits we get from data are largely qualitative today because we can't properly measure or effectively measure the financials. But come back to my point about is what problem are we trying to solve? And actually, if you're working with different parts of the business, then actually we should be able to get to the point of saying, if you can't solve this problem alone, but you can solve it with data, then actually let's do that together. And I take Miranda's point. The further you take the data away from its context, the less value it is. It's not, so you can only augment it by combining different contexts and different data sets in a smart way to actually create significantly more value.
Thank you, Eddie. Grant?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can think of any examples of using data to actually generate bottom line benefit. Yeah, it's the opposite. We've been working as a business, so for a construction business, we've been supporting and working through a project data analytics community that we've been involved in setting up. We've participated in 9 hackathons over the last couple of years, where we've been getting people together over a 2-day period. Data scientists, data analysts, project staff, operational people from construction businesses, and we're taking construction data, put it together with clever data people, and we've set some challenges and come up with some solutions. So we've had some really cool. We developed safety apps over a weekend, so sort of talking to your phone, sort of safety observation application that came out a weekend, which we're looking at sort of democratizing that. We did a piece of work with photographs from site to identify PPE compliance, which can now go in the front of a site entrance, so that it doesn't rely on somebody stopping someone because they aren't wearing the right protective equipment. The app, the little application we developed can do that. So that's safety examples. We've done some stuff around common quality problems, and so lots and lots and dozens of examples. And I can send David you a link of a website with some of the examples, and we're looking at democratizing those solutions on the Project Data Analytics website very shortly. So those can be available to anyone to help pick up and start to develop, because none of the we've got so many solutions, we haven't got the ability to pick them all up as individual organizations.
Grant, brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Right, we're up on time. I just want to say a massive thank you to each of our panelists and to everyone who listened in. Yeah, it's quite a nice way to end it, Grant, with an offer to share some data. So what will happen next is we'll produce, we'll publish the video, etc. Everyone will get a link, and we'll probably produce a kind of short summary of this as well. But yeah, thank you all very much for your time. Have good lunches and good weekends.
Thank you so much.
Thanks all.